everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and I'm so happy to be here with Fern Chapman, author, because today we have a special episode. We're going to be talking about estranged people from our community, the estrangers, and sibling estrangement. And this is an important subject because something happened recently in our community that we wanted to shed some light on, because of course our community constitutes these two types of individuals, right? Estranged people and those that had to estrange, and there's a recent conversation that came up in our Facebook group where somebody that was experiencing estrangement said that estranging others breaks up families and that there couldn't possibly be any good that comes out of not aiming to fix the problem and reconcile in families. And in fact, this member, who's now a former member, went so far as to state that it was unhealthy and imposed a moral judgment on those that are estranged and made it look as though in the community we were anti-family, which is far from the truth. And thankfully, we had members step in and remind this member that her own experience was her own and that she shouldn't judge other people and juxtapose her own experience onto that of others. That can vary greatly. So, this brought us back to the need to discuss what can happen when we don't make peace with our situation. So, thank you so much for being here, Fern.
It's wonderful to be here, and I think this is a really important topic related to what you just said. There's a wonderful old saying, which is, if you don't heal what hurt you, you'll bleed on people who didn't cut you.
Yeah.
And our former member may have been doing just that.
Well, that's exactly what I think as well. And it's unfortunate that that happens with some people because it illustrates that when people don't resolve their own conflicts, there's a danger of projecting onto other people their own situation and really where they get stuck. And I could see this because I had a bit of an exchange with this person. I was hoping, of course, to make peace and to explain that there's room for, of course, different experiences of estrangement in our community, and she just wouldn't have it. So this person was stuck in her own pattern of anger, and she remained omnipresent in that type of anger, and it just comes out in unhealthy and disproportionate ways, as we saw.
And I think there's a real lack of insight and understanding into somebody else's experience when you are that kind of holed up in that tower.
Yeah, yeah, that's what's sad with experiences like this, right? And because I think you and I understand essentially that when people estrange another person, they don't do it lightly. We live in this era where there's ghosting going on, where people suddenly cut people out of their lives, and it's a trendy thing now, right? We hear this word ghosting, right? And I think that a lot of times it's not the case with people that experience estrangement. People don't choose estrangement lightly. It's a buildup that happens, right? And I think this comes with both people that are experiencing estrangement and those that choose estrangement. It's something that builds up over time, and this is usually based on toxic behaviors that we may be, of course, experiencing over and over again, as a means of trying to break free from that and create empowerment and a demonstration of self-worth and self-preservation, particularly when we're choosing to estrange, right?
And a choice that you don't want to continue to get hurt. So it's the way I see it is it's a little bit like brick by brick this happens, whether through a conversation or an act. But you're not included in a wedding, you're not invited to family events, and this just keeps building brick by brick until you get to the point where you say, I can't continue this. I cannot allow myself to be put in this position where I'm chronically hurt.
I absolutely agree. I think eventually there comes that need, like we were saying, for self-preservation, right? That you need to step back and this is a type of grief that can be a challenge unto itself when you're having to estrange, because even though it's empowering, and that you feel as though you're reclaiming yourself, of course there can be situations of self-doubt, right? A legitimate feeling of missing certain elements of connection that can, potentially still be positive with another family member, a sibling and such. But of course, there's the toxicity. There's that other side, of course, that just makes it non relatable and salvageable, right?
And I think there's a misassumption that if you are the person who is doing the estranging, that you don't have grief. And in fact, that's not true.
Mhm.
I have done a survey where people were both the estrangee as well as the estranger, and both expressed deep feelings of sadness and grief and remorse, but they did not see a way to reconcile the relationship.
Yeah, and that's the thing that happens in that way. I think it's really hard for them in that way to understand, how to make meaning of this. And that's the thing that you and I attempt to do a lot in our community, is to help people, of course, experience a sense of meaning, a sense of harmonization within themselves, potentially healing of themselves when it comes to this. And I really think it's important when people have that back and forth, that euphoric recall, that they remember also why it broke down, especially if they're going like in a slump where they feel bad about the whole estrangement issue. It's really important that we, of course, recognize this was a process and it came to that point, right?
Yeah, and that euphoric recall can be so dangerous because it often pulls you right back into it.
Yeah, yeah. And this is, of course, what leads us to rumination and things of that nature. Of course, we've talked about this in other videos and how to deal with rumination, which is really important in the sibling estrangement community. But there's another point to this also, I think, that comes up with a lot of people. There's, of course, the exhibition of toxic behaviors, of course, that causes us to choose to estrange. But there's also another reason for people to estrange, which is this idea of not getting enough stimulation in the relationship, right? The lack of acknowledgement and reciprocity can also be a reason to step back, when it comes to that. And sometimes it's like we get these little breadcrumbs, right? And this is what happens with some people, is that if we continuously experience disappointment, it could lead to a sense of failure or even create emotional chaos and trauma, right?
Yeah, and sometimes it's just a bad match. Some siblings can never develop a solid, authentic, loving relationship, and it can lead to apathy. And if there's apathy and there isn't a lot to build on, particularly once the parents pass, because what happens is that final glue is gone. And they have to ask themselves, what am I obligated to do here? Do I need to sustain this relationship when my parents are no longer around?
Absolutely. And that's the hard thing too, in that way, right? There's this sense of obligation that we sometimes impose on ourselves, and even if we're not getting anything back from it can be really hard for some people. And, I use the analogy sometimes of, the idea that you wouldn't walk around with a pair of shoes that don't fit you, right? Because they'd hurt your feet. So why do we allow a relationship that's not nourishing and largely acknowledged to persist, right?
Right, and actually in my survey, a number of people addressed this point exactly. And one of them said something that I think speaks directly to what we're saying. The problem I have with my family is simply indifference. It isn't that we have ever had a big argument. There's just nothing.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting that we talk about this because, in particular, there was this Facebook meme that was circulating that I thought was really, really spot on. And I often don't comment on these type of things we see on these threads, when people put up posters and things of that nature. But I just don't have much time to do that. But in particular, there was one of them though that stood out that really I thought was appropriate to our community, and it was the idea of somebody saying, just reaching out, saying, "Hey, how was your day?" And the person responded by saying, I'm not getting a very satisfactory response from you when it comes to our exchanges. In fact, I find you giving me often short answers when I elaborate greatly on my situation. I share my feelings and I get understimulated and I get a response that ends up being disappointing. So I'm going to be stepping back from this relationship because, frankly, I'm bored with you. And I thought that was a great response to somebody that had that buildup, of course, of being understimulated constantly.
Right. I mean, it's funny if it's one conversation, but I think the larger point is this is something that happens over and over and over again
Yeah,
to the point where there's really no mutuality. And if there's no mutuality, there isn't much of a relationship.
I absolutely agree. I think that's really, really important, that there needs to be mutuality and reciprocity, right? That it's feeding and nourishing you, right? And oftentimes, we talk about this, like if you can't get that within your family structure with a sibling, you need to look for it elsewhere, you know? And if for whatever reason I find, that if maybe you've seen this also, that things get better with some people as well too, and it does happen, right? I mean, it's not always that people are perpetually experiencing negativity with this. Sometimes there are elements of improving their situation. I often mention that there's nothing wrong with modifying our boundaries if the situation has changed for the better, you know?
Right, but there's also often the opposite experience, which is abuse. And if you're in a chronically injurious or insulting relationship with a sibling, there's really not much hope that this is going to change unless that person goes to therapy and becomes aware of what they're doing. I had people who responded again to my survey, and they would say things that, like, my sister and I have had deep issues all my life, and I can't take her abuse anymore. It's just too painful.
Exactly, right? And that's the thing too. And this is something I've noticed also in the Facebook group that we do, that sometimes what ends up happening with some people is they've been through the cycle too often that they just don't want to do that anymore, right? And it's fine. It's absolutely fine. You're the best person suited to be able to decide that for yourself. Even if you think it improves, but you don't want to go through it in that way, that's a personal choice. If you want to, or you're encouraged with it and you think it can, then it's absolutely fine to try and see in some ways if it does get better, right? Because there is, of course, that notion that people can be overly protective of themselves with reason in some cases, but other times we can over insulate ourselves, right? So we don't walk around in the summertime with a winter coat, right?
It's interesting. I was thinking while you were responding that there is a lot of criticism right now of therapists who encourage young adults and adults to cut off from their parents. And there's this attitude that they're way too quick to just say, that's enough. But again, what's not recognized is all the small incidents, all the conversations that led to that break point. And I think we need to underscore that. It's never just one situation.
I absolutely agree with you. It's a process that builds up over time, right? And this is something that people need to understand as to why people estrange, right? They
Right.
estrange because of the fact that this has been building up over time. And they got to the point where they got fed up because it's not easy for us to experience a cutoff with a particular family member, and it's true though that there can be some premature responses perhaps in some cases within some therapeutic settings, but also there needs to be the acknowledgement of the fact that it's a process that builds over time. And if people have gotten to that point, it's because they've exasperated all the other paths.
And sometimes they just need a break. It's not necessarily permanent. They just need to step away for a while to sort out what this relationship has been and what it's given them and what it's taken from them.
I absolutely agree with you. So it's really important that we, of course, acknowledge that there's reasons for us to estrange, like we're saying, and of course, when we're estranged, we're getting a response, of course, that is, of course, difficult and challenging as well, too. So I think that there's certainly room in our community for both of these experiences, of course, because as I like to mention in my group, it's the pain of sibling estrangement that binds us all together. And I think that's the thing when it comes to supporting ourselves, understanding each other. So long as we can do that in a kind way and it can be helpful and that we're supporting people, that's what's important ultimately, So there's very much room for these two experiences to coexist.
I want to add to what you said and talk about two other factors that often play into a withdrawal from a relationship. One is addiction or mental illness. People feel they have to save themselves rather than fall into this rabbit hole of trying to help an addicted family member. And that is a real dilemma when there is somebody who is drug dependent or an alcoholic or mentally ill.
Yeah. Absolutely. There can be these underlying conditions, of course, that come up. You're absolutely right. I think that it's really important not to be dismissive of that when people have chosen to estrange. There might be some underlying reasons like that that cause people to want to step back because of the volatility, because of the unpredictability, toxic nature of certain behaviors, of course, So it may be necessary for people's own mental health, as a matter of fact, to be
Yeah.
able to say, okay, I've had enough, and you be you, I'll be me, right? So it's really, really important that we, of course,
Again, self-preservation and
yeah,
self-protection. But the second big factor that I've identified is narcissism. Children who are raised in narcissistic families are often pitted against each other as siblings. And there's a lot of narcissistic triangulation when a family member tries to control the flow and interpretation of, and the nuances of communication. And in these families, children who are raised in narcissistic homes rarely feel a strong sense of connection to each other as adults.
yeah, you're absolutely right, because that was never nourished at a young age, right? There is a very much of a conditional type of love being, of course, experienced in these type of families, right? And the whole notion of power struggles, power structures, hierarchies, implied hierarchies in some ways where people can get a one up on someone else and such, and how that's even favored and encouraged with within narcissistic families. So that's really, really important, of course, to understand that there can be these type of situations that cause people to step back and say, okay, I can't be having that anymore. So
Okay.
yeah,
Let me just elaborate a little bit, and that is to say, what is a narcissist? And it's somebody who has an exaggerated sense of self-importance and entitlement and shows arrogance, haughtiness, conceitedness, monopolizes conversations, belittles others, and generally fails to recognize the needs and the feelings of others.
exactly. That last point there, the lack of empathy, right? The lack of understanding and acknowledgement, right? And I just wrote about this recently on my blog there, siblingestrangement.com. I talked about acknowledgement and how it's such an important factor for us to have, right? And whether you're understimulated or you're experiencing toxic behaviors and you've had to estrange for your own good, it's often because there's that lack of acknowledgement, right? That sense that you're not being understood or there's not room made for you to be you in that particular relationship, right? So that's really, really important for our viewers to understand that there's that particular experience going on, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, of course, underneath all this that causes people to estrange. So Fern, we're almost out of time. I just wanted to check with you, of course, if there's any resources you thought you'd like to mention with regards to our viewers in terms of something that can help them to get through this.
Well, you and I both do counseling and coaching, and we don't have time to help everybody, but we do try to help the few that come to us. And it's something that makes me understand estrangement all that much better as I see patterns in certain relationships that are repeated.
Yeah, very, very important, of course, to recognize that and see how it is that people can, of course, approach us and be able to talk with us about this, of course. And I do, of course, offer some help, as do you, when it comes to this particular experience in terms of working on some of these issues that, of course, arise and such. My number one resource at this point would probably be the Sibling Estrangement Support Group at this time. That's really, really important. People can get a lot of practical advice in real time, and they can get a sense of empowerment, right? They can feel better about themselves, plus knowing they're not alone in their experiences, right? That's super important because oftentimes we can feel isolated with this, right? Because it's not everybody that gets sibling estrangement. So that would be my number one resource at this time. Of course, I do offer some workshops, of course, on improving self-esteem within the confines of sibling estrangement. So that is also very important. With regards to that, if people would like to contact me and see to have more information about that, that should be, of course, a good resource for some people that want to dive deeper. So those are the two things, of course, and of course we can mention our the sibling estrangement Facebook page, right? Sibling estrangement, sharing, coping, connecting. As you see on screen, of course, and that's also very much of a good resource that you can, of course, go on into the community and of course, have some support and understanding from people going through the same experience as you.
Which actually was the reason for this particular discussion, that somebody raised some of these issues on the page, and we're grateful for that.
Absolutely. So I'm very happy for us to be able to talk about this, and I'm certain that our viewers are as well too. So thank you so much for sharing this, Fern. It's wonderful to be able to exchange on this and talk more at length and in depth about this. And I very much look forward to our next video again.
I do too. Thanks again, Ellie John.
All right, you take care, Fern.